You, Ari. So I'm going to talk for 35 minutes, and then I really hope to get to your questions. As Ari said, I was in academics for 18 years, but not all of that was full-time work. And so I languished in adjunct purgatory for too long. When we came down to San Diego in 2009, I was the rabbi in residence at the San Diego Jewish Academy. Didn't last long. So from 2010 to 2019, I was underemployed. And in 2010, somebody asked me a question at shul that then turned itself into Coherent Judaism. So that is the origin story. And now I'm going to share with you the so necessary PowerPoint so that you can get an idea of what I did, of what I'm talking about. All right, slideshow from the beginning. All right, here we go. So that's my cover. That's my cover. And you might not recognize that creature, but it is a mandrill. A mandrill is, related to the baboons. I got a lot of teasing about having a self-portrait on the cover of my book and how egotistical it was, but, you got to do what you got to do. The Hebrew underneath the mandrill's punim says Mishaneh HaBriot, and that is from a Mishnah. So it goes back about 2,000 years. And it's a blessing that we say when we see a weird-looking creature. A weird-looking creature. So we're recognizing that God varies creation, that God switches things around. And that's what I call the Darwin blessing. Right? Because if you remember a little bit about what Charles Darwin had to say, that these very slight differences amongst the same species will eventually confer an adaptive advantage so that after generation, after generation, after generation, these little small incremental changes will suddenly become so different from where they had begun that there are considered to be two different species. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. I was at Brandeis working with Art Green for a bunch of years. And the one thing that struck me as interesting enough to stay with for 3 years to actually write a book-length treatment on was the relationship between Judaism and science. And most things had been covered, with the kind of glaring exception of Jewish responses to Darwinism. So in my dissertation, I looked at kind of 24 different thinkers having to do or having responded to Darwinism and kind of what was in their argumentation that was novel, what was in their argumentation that was a continuation of traditional Jewish thought, and what their arguments may have had to do with other things that were going on in the environment at the time. Okay, I told you that a buddy of mine asked me this question at shul. The question that he asked me was, when Isaac was duped by Jacob, his son, into giving Jacob the blessing that was meant for Esau. Everybody with me? I hope you're with me. Why didn't Isaac just take back the blessing that he had given in bad faith to Jacob, who had tricked him, take back the blessing and give it to his son Esau? And when I told my buddy the answer to that question that I knew, which isn't always the case, but I happen to know it, he said, "That's stupid." Now, this is a bright guy. And the problem with his answer was that he was right. It is stupid coming from our worldview. But our worldview wasn't the same worldview that was shared by the author of that particular story in the Bible. They had a different understanding of the world. And in their understanding of the world, you can't take back blessings that you've given. It doesn't work like that. But it was that's stupid that stuck with me. And it stuck with me because I am a person of faith. And that's not a popular thing to be in the Jewish world. It's, I think, particularly problematic in America, where Jews are highly educated. Highly educated people tend not to be religious. The people who are highly religious tend to be conservative Republicans who think that the world was created the way it is now within the last 10,000 years. That's this chart down here. From as long as Gallup has been taking polls since 1983, between 40 and 44% of Americans, of all Americans, I hope you're all sitting down, between 40 and 44% of Americans believe that the world was created pretty much as it is right now within the last 10,000 years. That's stupid. And so to share this general category of faith with other folks who are not particularly sophisticated or educated is uncomfortable and it's challenging. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to write something as massive, let me show you how big this is. It's a big book, right? It's 500 and, I don't know, it's over 500 pages. That's a lot of pages. I've never written that much. Herman Wouk once said that his idea of hell was to have to drag around everything that he's ever written, from like notes to drafts to books, and he had to like schlep it around. So I hope I don't have to do that, because there were a lot of drafts and a lot of pages in this one. But my goal was to present a Judaism that was sophisticated, that was not laughable, that was something that people like Chris Hitchens and Richard Dawkins could understand as not their cup of tea, but not stupid. And part of the problem with people like Dawkins and Hitchens and Stephen Jay Gould, for that matter, was that as much as they may be experts in their field, they know nothing about religious history. And they might be able to read the Bible and read what contemporary Bible scholars have to say about the Bible, but that's not Thomas Aquinas, and that's not Maimonides, and that's not Al-Ghazali. That's not people who have really been dealing with these issues in a religious tradition for 1,000 years, who wrote close to 1,000 years ago. Okay, so I hope that while I have been talking, people have had a chance to read some of these things that I wrote on the PowerPoint slide. Nope, other way. Okay, so really, Coherent Judaism is an apologia. It is my way of defending my opinions, and more importantly, because we're Jews, my conduct. Because as you know, and as I'm gonna hopefully explain why, Jews are more about the deed than the creed. Jews are more about the deed than the creed. It is an overgeneralization, but it's so true. We Jews know how little God talk there is in services. It's got a bunch of different reasons, but I'm going to lay bare, I hope, what one of the primary factors is in the primacy of deed over creed in traditional Judaism. Okay, so let's define our terms. Theology is God talk. Theology is what we think about God and how God relates to our world. Religion is different than theology. Religion is, given what we believe about God and how God relates to the world, how should we respond? Religion is about what we do given our theology. In Judaism, we have a religion of Halakhah. Right? What we do, Jewish tradition, Jewish law, Jewish custom, right? I'm putting that all under the umbrella category of Halakhah, and that is our religion. Okay, so here's something that is not controversial in the non-Orthodox world. From the time that the Torah was stitched together and canonized, there were multiple theologies. Two of the main theologies were the priestly theology that you find in the book of Leviticus, and the, for lack of a better term, and I explain why I chose the word in the book, a Mosaic theology that I associate with the book of Deuteronomy. Two mutually exclusive theologies placed by an editor into one book. Why could conflicting, mutually exclusive theologies be placed within two of the same covers? Because both theologies, although they're mutually exclusive, they promote a religion of mitzvot. What they have you do is more or less the same, even though they look at the world philosophically, theologically, metaphysically, in very different ways. Okay. Very briefly, in the priestly world that we have lost because we no longer engage in animal sacrifices at the temple, what the priest's main job was to sacrifice animals, right, at the altar. In that theology, God's presence in our community was a direct consequence of our behavior. God was repulsed by transgressions, and God was attracted by the sacrifices that were conducted in order to remedy the effects of the transgressions that had pushed God away. When we behave righteously, God is present in our midst, and God has a protective presence. When we commit transgressions, God is pushed away, like when two poles of a magnet come together and they're repulsed. That's how God responds to our unholy behavior. And the only way to draw God back into our camp for the priests was to engage in sacrifices. Okay, it is a natural consequence. It's how parents ideally want to train their children. What needs to be remembered for the purposes of biblical theology is that God's presence protects us, and God's absence leaves us vulnerable to the bad Assyrians and the bad Babylonians and the bad Romans and okay, fill in the blank. The other theology is much, much more familiar to us because of the prayer book, because the prayer book decided to take the Mosaic theology, which is carrot and stick, and enshrine it in the liturgy. So God's presence in this theology is independent of what we do, whether it's mitzvot, whether it's sacrifices, whether it's transgressions. But we get good stuff when we do good things because God gives us good stuff. God rewards us with rain in our season, and God punishes us with droughts when we transgress. So the Mosaic theology is carrot and stick, reward and punishment. The priestly theology is natural consequences. The effects generally are similar, but the way in which those effects come about, how we get the rewards and how we get the punishments, are very different. Okay. Within the biblical period and the rabbinic period, meaning from 1000 BCE to 600 CE, you have these conflicting ideologies. So we've spoken about theology and religion. The third piece of this is anthropology. What do we think about us, about Jews? In the priestly anthropology, the way the priests think about Jews is that we are essentially holy. We are godlike in a way that Gentiles are not. It is not a comfortable thing to say, and that's what the priests believed. And in this hierarchical world of the priests, there was the high priest and the Levite and the Israelite and the Munzer, and then the Gentile. The priestly worldview was shot through with these different distinctions and gradations and hierarchies. On the Mosaic side, folks, we have statements like Amos. Again, they're both in the Bible, these theologies, and they're both in the Talmud, these anthropologies. To me, O Israelites, you're just like the Ethiopians. We are the chosen people because God chose us. But that doesn't confer any intrinsic quality of holiness. This is a chosen people theology, that we were chosen strictly because God named us as the chosen people. You can still argue that it's racist because in God's eyes, we're chosen. That's not what I'm defending or promoting one way or the other. What I'm saying is that in this anthropology, there's nothing unique, there's nothing divine, there's nothing holy about Jews other than God's selection of the Israelites to be in this special relationship. Okay. So here's where I think there will be some light bulbs going off. So about 10 years ago, a relatively young scholar, David Grossberg, did a study. And what he said is on the left. I'll read it. A detailed study of the entire Mishnah shows that ostensibly doctrinal matters, in other words, theology, are consistently addressed in the language of praxis, in other words, mitzvot. Deed trumped creed. In the very first literary product of Rabbinic Judaism, the first literary product that was written by the folks who eventually became the Jews after the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, didn't emphasize or didn't really address particularly theology connected to religion. It just promoted praxis or religion. I am claiming that for a widely dispersed people, because we were exiled by the Romans, the rabbis chose the strategy of uniformity of distinctive practice rather than the uniformity of belief in order to preserve our national identity. Every other exiled people had disappeared. The 10 lost tribes of Israel disappeared. What constituted a people was the same language, an army that was protecting geographic borders. After the Romans exiled us, we didn't share a language, we didn't share a geography, and we didn't have an army. None of the trappings of a national entity did we enjoy, yet we survived, thanks to the rabbi's decision to promote deed over creed. Because the deed could be maintained in exile, the creed, unclear. Okay. What did I just do? All right. This is a midrash that many, many of you will be familiar with. It's been misunderstood ever since Rambam. It's been misunderstood ever since Maimonides in the 12th century read it and told people how to read it. And they said, oh, well, that's how Rambam reads it. That must be how it's meant to be. Okay. I would love to see a show of hands. Rav said the mitzvot were given only to refine humanity. Litzaref bahen et habriot. Why should God care which side of the neck an animal is slaughtered, this side or this side? How many people have heard that the mitzvot were given to refine us, to make us better human beings? Okay, I can't see everybody. I can just see a handful. That's not what the midrash means. The word litzaref is a term from metallurgy. It does mean refine, but it's about refining metals, separating the good stuff from the bad stuff. In this midrash, it's about separating the Jews, the good stuff, from the Gentiles, the bad stuff. And the example that they give is kashrut, right? Kashrut doesn't make us more spiritually refined or morally refined. It makes us sociologically distinct, separate, refined. But Maimonides was less interested in that, so he gave this reading in the Guide of the Perplexed, this idea that the mitzvot were given to make us better human beings. Some of the mitzvot clearly were, but not this one. And the tip-off is that in the guide, when he introduces this midrash from the rabbis, he specifically says, this midrash at first is going to amaze and perplex you. Why would it amaze and perplex us, right? There's lots of statements in the Talmud about making us better people. This just isn't one of them. Okay. We have done a great job. Okay, let's not give ourselves too much credit. The rabbis did a great job of figuring out a way for us to survive exile. Okay. In this world of the priestly Torah, there have been there's been some residue. There have been some vestiges of what I'm calling the priestly Torah. So my friend didn't understand why the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob couldn't be undone, because words have intrinsic power in the priestly worldview. God creates the world in Genesis 1 through speech. That's meant to be understood. I don't want to say literally, but that's the mechanism of creation, okay? And that's why vows and oaths cannot be broken in the priestly world. By the time we get to the Talmud, there is a dispute. And some rabbis say, no, we can, under certain circumstances, if the intention of the person making the oath is discovered to have been flawed in some way, then we can rewind the oath. Another position is that you can't rewind the oath. The best you can do is find a loophole. Okay, the consequence is similar, right? You get around the oath. But when you have to find a loophole, you have to find a loophole because the oath can't be rewound. It can't be dissolved. Marriage. Folks, what I say to a couple under the chuppah is that the ketubah is only there in case things go sideways. What effects, with an E, what makes the marriage between the man and the woman is the specific formula that the man says to the woman. Harayat mikudeshet, that one. Okay, if I were to say it in front of all of you, I would be married to 153 people, some of whom are married, some of whom aren't the right gender, according to the rabbis. I'd be getting in big, big trouble. This is what explains the agunah. Just like the boy had to say a specific formula to effect the marriage, the boy has to say a specific formula in order to undo the marriage. He can't rewind the marriage and make it nullified as though it never existed, but he can dissolve the marriage. Okay, so now I want to stop for a second. The reason why we have these straw widows, these chained women to husbands, is because ultimately of a metaphysics that no one believes anymore, that words create outside of our head, that words create a new reality. happy to acknowledge that words influence our perception of reality inside our thinking apparatus. But what the priestly worldview holds is that words actually create a different reality outside of our own consciousness. Okay. In the Torah, it says that we can't eat stuff. The Torah doesn't tell us why we can't eat stuff. We've got some pretty good ideas, we're not sure. The Torah also doesn't say, but if you intended to do something and you got it wrong, and so a little bit of this got into that, don't worry about it. The Torah makes no exceptions. The rabbis do. Anybody who keeps a kosher kitchen knows that if a little tiny bit of milk falls into a meat pot that's boiling, as long as the quantity is less than 1/60th of the meat, you don't have to throw away the whole meat pan. That's the Mosaic ideology. That is not priestly. And we know it's not priestly because this other work of rabbinics says, no. If there's a little bit of the milk that flies in that meat stew, that's a mixture of milk and meat. That's biblically forbidden. You have to throw it all away. That position exists, and we decide to poskin, to adjudicate. We decide to adjudicate in another direction. So this is a case where in the Rabbinic period, the rabbis are faced with an option of whether to preserve that priestly worldview or to preserve the Mosaic view that names what is kosher and not kosher. And in this case with kashrut, the rabbis chose to preserve the biblical naming system rather than the essence system of the priests. And they're naming something kosher as long as the amount of problematic substance is less than 1/60th. Okay. In this priestly worldview, time is different. Shabbos time is different than holiday time, is different than mundane time. That is the reason why when one violates the Sabbath, it's such a big deal. That is why if one inadvertently violates Shabbat, you can repair the damage with an animal sacrifice. But if you intentionally violate Shabbat, that's the death penalty. The reason why it's so serious is because the fabric of the world that God made corresponds to the laws that we have in the priestly Torah. So that when we violate the laws, it throws the world off kilter. And the only way to get the system working right, the only way to get the world back on its axis is to rectify the transgression. If the transgression was inadvertent, you can rectify the transgression through an animal sacrifice. If it was intentional, you die. Okay. There are some juicy debates in the Talmud that if you look at them on the surface, you think these guys had too much time on their hands. It hurts me when I hear people say that. The rabbis were these incredible intellectual giants of their day. Once you understand what's going on in their debates, all of a sudden, they're not stupid anymore. And like, if my biggest contribution to the world of Jewish studies is to demonstrate that Rabbi Eliezer wasn't stupid, like my work will have been fulfilled. I will be gratified. Here, I'm going to give you 3 examples. A Jew was kidnapped at an early age and raised by Gentiles. As a young man, he discovers he's Jewish. According to one priestly voice in the Talmud, he is liable to offer a sacrifice for each Shabbat violation he ever committed, even though he didn't know he was Jewish, even though he didn't know about Shabbat, even though he didn't know what a Shabbat violation was, because the damage to the cosmos has been done and the damage needs to be undone. And the only way the damage can be undone is by these sacrifices. If you don't know that, then you look at this priestly voice and you're like, that's stupid. Okay, let's get even more stupid. A priest's wife is having a meal of special priest food called truma. So she's sitting there and eating her truma. Somebody bursts through the kitchen door into her home and says, "Stop eating! Your husband, the priest, dead." Which means you're no longer a priest's wife. And if you're no longer a priest's wife, baby, you can't eat that special priest food. Rabbi Eliezer demands her to repay all the food she consumed since being a widow, plus a 20% fine, because that's what the Torah says is necessary to repair the damage to the cosmos. So it's not that Rabbi Eliezer is a misogynist, and it's not that he is a strict interpretationist. It's that he is operating under a different theology, under a different worldview, where the only way to correct the damage to the cosmos is to remedy it with what he is saying. And finally, the most outrageous. This guy has a tough name to pronounce. Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada testified about a stolen beam that had already been built into a house. Okay. The sages taught if somebody robbed another person of a beam and then built it into a house, Beit Shammai says, and Eliezer is part of the Beit Shammai tradition, you've got to destroy the entire house in order to return that beam that had been built into the house. You have to return it to its owner. That's the priestly worldview. Beit Hillel says, no. You only need to provide the victim of the theft with the value of the beam, and that's called takanat shavim. It's an ordinance due for the sake of tshuva, for the sake of the penitent. Because how many people, when they start to feel guilty that they've robbed somebody of a piece of wood, how many people are going to be motivated to do tshuva if what the tshuva entails, if what the repentance entails is knocking down the whole house? It's much more likely that they're going to return the value of the beam than to destroy the house that had been built with the beam. Fair? Reasonable? Totally. That's why we're Beit Hillel. But look at what the rabbis did. Beit Shammai's position that I just told you about was written on this page of the Talmud. On this page of the Talmud, right, you just turn the page, is the story of the destruction of the temple. The word that's used for house in the Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel dispute is birah, and in 4 places in the Torah, the very last books, the word birah is used for the temple. So what the rabbis are doing is saying that that priestly philosophy of law brought down the house of God. That kind of inflexibility, that idea that you have to repair the cosmos rather than compensate the individual, is a surefire method of destroying the entire edifice of the religion. Okay. That was my first set of motivations. Here's my second. The priestly Torah has a bunch of legacies. I am very careful. I promise you that before I buy any clothes, I make sure that there is no shatnez. No shatnez, no wool and linen. I don't think it's a moral issue. There's plenty of opportunities for me to get clothes that don't have wool and linen combined in them. No problem. But the prohibition on homosexuality is part of the priestly Torah. That now has become a moral issue. The way in which the conservative movement dealt with that issue, in my opinion, is inadequate. It didn't recognize the rationale behind the separation that is endemic to the priestly Torah. And what the conservative movement said was, we are going to undo what the rabbis did. The rabbis said no male physical intimacy. The Torah says no male anal intercourse. That we can't touch. So for the conservative movement, the prohibition on male anal intercourse is still on the books. The rabbis are told to not discuss it, and that when gay male couples want to come in to be married, if they want to ask about sexual details, you can let them know, but you're not supposed to be proactive. I don't think that level of don't ask, don't tell is to anybody's benefit. I think that we should say this prohibition is a function of a worldview that we now reject. Okay, so that's something that we have, that's an example of a provision, specifically the rabbinic prohibitions around male homosexuality, that we have sunset. Here's something that I think that we should modify. The problem of agunot is a function of recalcitrant husbands who weaponize an incoherent theology or philosophy of language to punish women. Just as the rabbis say that we can benefit someone when they are not present, we can benefit the husband by telling the scribe to write a get for this woman, because as Maimonides says, it's in his best interest to write a get for this woman. And that's why Maimonides says you can beat the hell out of a recalcitrant husband. Maimonides says you can beat up a recalcitrant husband until he says, write her a get. We can't do that in this country. So since we can't beat up a recalcitrant husband, we can do something else that is in his best interest, because he doesn't want to be a jerk. Nobody wants to be a jerk. But according to Maimonides, he is temporarily blinded by rage and by vindictiveness. And so you beat him until that vindictiveness goes away and he says, write her a get. That's modifying a provision. Here's really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in adding provisions. Okay. My claim is that the Torah's goal is to live long on the land that the Lord your God has given you. That is an uncontroversial claim. So let me say it more strongly. If somebody asks you what the goal of the Torah is, the goal of the narrative parts of the Torah from the beginning to the end is to get the Israelites to the land of Israel, keep them there, and once they were exiled, to get them back. That's what the primary objective is in the Torah. In order to further that primary objective, the rabbis legislated a law over here in the Mishnah. It's forbidden to rear small herd animals in the land of Israel. They don't tell you why. The Gemara tells you why. Because they eat stuff in order to feed these goats and lambs. The amount of people that could be fed by the vegetation that these small animals eat is significantly greater than the number of people who can be fed from the meat of the animal. And so the rabbis decided, in a kind of diet for the small earth way 2,000 years ago, to prohibit, not to prohibit the consumption and not to prohibit the importation of small herd animals, but you can't grow them in the land of Israel because we need the vegetation that those animals would eat. We need that vegetation to feed our own people. Where did that come from? It came from the rabbi's power to further the Torah's primary goal of living long on the land. The real ultimate reason that I wrote this book is because we are in an environmental crisis, and we need to mobilize every resource we have available to us. I believe that religion can be a powerful ally in facing the environmental crisis and in making the kinds of sacrifices that are necessary in order to get us through in a survivable, sustainable way. We have survived in environments which were hostile to our existence, and the Torah, the foundation document, is a land-based legal framework. Like, we've got all kinds of land-based laws already waiting to be updated. And so Halakhah, I believe, can address the environmental obstacles that all of us face in living long on the land that the Lord our God has given us. And I think that this is ultimately a way that we can make Jews and Judaism into a green light unto the nations. Happy to have questions.
Well, we have to digest a lot because that was a big book and it was a lot of material, but people, please, I'm going to open up the chat so you can chat to me and we can ask questions. Let me start with a few. I understand why you have posited in your dichotomy the priestly side, but why do you call the other side the Mosaic side?
So you're asking just a question about the naming?
Yes.
Yeah. So Deuteronomy is called Torah Moshe, right? It's referred to. And the other, so it's identified with Moses himself. And I explain in my book that the priestly Torah is primarily concerned with priestly stuff, whereas the Mosaic Torah is equally concerned with priestly stuff and non-priestly stuff and agriculture and soldiers and politics. So it's a mosaic of different interest groups. So both in terms of the small m mosaic that reflect the interests of the Mosaic Torah and its association with Moshe Rabbeinu.
Ironically, Moses was a Levite and his brother was the Kohen, so they're very linked.
Yeah.
So it was a little confusing. Do you think
it is? And you know, one of the things that, you know, when you start really looking, the priestly Torah is very clear about Kohanim and Levi'im. These are not the same thing. But in the book of Deuteronomy, they're Kohanim Levi'im, right? They're mushed together as a single group. And so again, the kind of rigid hierarchy that you see in Leviticus, you don't see in Deuteronomy.
So when you're looking at the rabbis, and you told us the rabbis are the ones who kind of saved Judaism in the way by emphasizing the deed over creed. But do you now read rabbis when you go to the Talmud and say, oh, this is a priestly kind of sided rabbi versus a Mosaic sided rabbi? So do you think Shammai is a more priestly sided and Hillel is more of the Mosaic sided, and that's the battle that we're really reading in there?
Correct. And not only that, Ari, when you go to the Middle Ages, Jewish mysticism is priestly. And Jewish philosophy is a reincarnation of the Mosaic Torah. The lines between the priestly Torah and Kabbalah are clear. The lines between the Mosaic Torah and Maimonides are dotted, but it's also, it's also very clear. And I think, you know, if I may kind of be autobiographical for a moment, it took somebody who's not a specialist. It took somebody like me who's a generalist, who's well-versed in Kabbalah, because I studied with Art Green for my PhD, who was able to really see the continuities between Shammai and Eliezer, the Zohar, and the priestly school in the Torah. Because we train our scholars to be so narrow in their focus, these kinds of larger conceptual bridges in Judaism, I mean, you know, I don't think I'm such a Talmud Chacham for figuring it out, but that it hadn't happened earlier, I think is a function, is an artifact of our educational system that really discourages people from looking broadly.
Norbert asked a good question, which is, if you're going to go back, if you're going to separate the priestly versus Mosaic, and you gave us examples of things that you're fine living with, like your shatnez, you're fine with that.
Yeah.
Even though that is very much a priestly maybe requirement because it's a cosmic issue that you may not understand. Then you went on to homosexuality, saying, well, that one we're not going to accept, right? Why would you accept the shatnez? Why? I mean, first of all, they're not. Someone asked. They're not connected anyway, other than that these are written in the Bible, and these are two examples of, from your perspective, priestly requirements that affect the cosmic nature of the world, but they're not connected directly.
No, they're not connected directly, but they're both examples of separation.
Right. So why would you do shatnez?
Yeah. So there's two answers. In general, I'm kind of conservative with a small c. And unless I have a good reason to ditch a tradition, I'm not going to ditch a tradition. So what are my good reasons? Morality and burden. So if it falls under the category of morality, then I think we have so many other moral dictates in the Torah that command us to privilege morality over ritual, that the way in which the conservative movement justified relaxing the prohibitions around homosexuality speak to me not only about relaxing those conditions, but about bracketing the Torah's prohibition on male anal intercourse, because it's about morality. The other thing that we've done at our synagogue as of 2 weeks ago is we've gotten rid of the second day of holidays. Not Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah has 2 days even in Israel. But for all of the second day, and there's 5 of them, it's onerous. People have voted with their feet. The people who come, many of the people who come don't come out of any other reason than a sense of obligation. The original reason, here's a parallel point, Ari. The original reason why there were 2 days was because we weren't sure which day was the right day. Now we're sure. So I would say the original reason for prohibition was this priestly worldview that we don't accept. We don't accept it about separation of people. We don't accept it about the intrinsic holiness of Jews. We don't accept it about the creation of reality through speech. So I don't accept the entire priestly Torah in terms of its religion. I happen to accept the priestly theology. I think that, and that was one of the shocks for me when I was writing the book, that I think that the priests had it exactly right, that God's presence is a function of our behavior. And our righteous behavior and holy behavior keeps God in the camp, and our transgressions repulses God's presence. And so part of the question of the book is, can we have a coherent Judaism that takes a theology from here and a religion from here and an anthropology from here?
So are you the only conservative synagogue in America that doesn't keep second days of festivals?
No, there's a few others.
Okay. One less day of Pesach?
Correct.
Okay. We'll have to talk to Rabbi Spitz about that. Michael Rubin wants to know, well, before the creed versus deed, what was the creed before we split, according to you?
Yeah, so, you've got the priestly creed and the Mosaic creed.
So there wasn't one creed then from
No,
going
and
back
that's the whole
further
point. There were mutually exclusive creeds. And the reason why they could coexist was because the practical consequences of those creeds in terms of behavior and deed had such a tremendous overlap.
So how has this book been accepted then by your fellow rabbis, male and female rabbis in the conservative movement?
I don't know. The first real response is coming out later this month. So there's an online journal called Zramim that has dedicated the next issue to reviewing the book from different authors and scholars. So I'll have a sense of it then. But we'll see.
I'm looking to see if people have other questions in our last few minutes here. David Phillips says, shouldn't we leave the tension between priestly and Mosaic versus declaring Mosaic the victor? Which I guess is saying that's nice to have that tension. Maybe that's something that's cool about Judaism.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it a tension as much as an option. And I love having the option. And that's why I prefer the priestly theology. I don't at all declare the Mosaic Torah a winner in all cases, precisely because the God of the Mosaic Torah is the one who gives us rain in our season when we're obedient and punishes us with drought when we're disobedient. And I think, it's theologies like that that make a mockery of the Shoah. It's what Falwell said after 9/11, that the Twin Towers fell, and the Twin Towers represent two erect penises, and the Twin Towers is God's punishment for the United States permissiveness regarding homosexuality. And so not only do we know it was a punishment, but because of the shape of the Twin Towers, we know what it was a punishment for. Now, that might be an offensive theology, but that's a perfectly legitimate biblical theology, and it's Mosaic. So I reject
that. Last question. So I don't know whether it's Elkins Park or here in California. Have you had opportunity to interact with other religious teachers or rabbis, philosophers from other faiths, about these complicated issues to see how they grapple in their own tradition? And if so, how do you find common ground with, you started off by saying that there's certain religious people that 44% of America believes the world is 10,000 years old, or that the world is exactly as it was.
Yeah.
So, and we have it in our own tradition. So my question is, how do you interact with people like that? How do you have discussions then, if you have fundamentally different views of the world?
So I haven't had any kind of interfaith exchanges with that group of Protestants. For the last 4 years, I was in San Diego. I taught at the University of San Diego, a Catholic school. So they have a much more sophisticated theology than the kinds of Protestants that are being referenced in that poll. And I did actually do a presentation to the faculty, to the Religious Studies and Theology faculty, about how Christianity is predicated on the priestly Torah, and Judaism is largely predicated on the Mosaic Torah. And the Bible person who was there, the academic Bible person, kept nodding that, yes, Cherry's right, Cherry's right. And the theological studies people were very uncomfortable, because for, I don't want to say centuries, but I guess I could. For centuries, the Christians have been, but it's mostly been Protestants, to be fair, they've been particularly dismissive and critical of Leviticus. And when I demonstrated, kind of leaving little room for challenge, that the theology of sacrifice from Leviticus and a blood sacrifice from Leviticus in order to atone vicariously for one's transgressions is exactly the model of Christianity, where Jesus was the blood sacrifice to atone for humanity's transgressions in the Christian worldview. There was discomfort with that.
Well, sorry, I wasn't in the room. My last question to you, which is kind of, let's go back just a little bit. Since I am a Kohen, I'm a priest, now you've put me in this quandary. Who do I go with, my people? But where do you think, it appears to me from my limited research and reading that we got our priestly story from other traditions, and it really does seem to tie into Egyptology. If you look at Egyptian beliefs and their priests and even the outfits they wore and the artwork is very similar to ours. So I want to go back a step. Do you think about like where the priests got their cosmology from and where this all comes from before us? Or is it, do you think this is specifically Jewish, or do you think, as with other things, that we historically picked up and made it our own from other traditions on the priestly side?
So you said, is it what kind of Jewish, or did we take it and kind of,
in other words,
give it our own Jewish twist?
Is it like an authentically Jewish creation, which I don't know many things are, maybe monotheism potentially, right? So we argue. But since you've divided the world into this priestly versus Mosaic, I'm just saying, go back a step. Where did they come from?
Yeah. So, this is really where I throw up my hands and say, I'm not a Bible guy. Joshua Berman has a pretty interesting and readable book called Ani Ma'amin. I think it's just called I Believe in English. And I think that Richard Elliott Friedman's last book, The Exodus, presents really similar evidence as to the architecture of the tabernacle and the palanquin, the stuff, the things that you put on your shoulder, and how those map on to the Egyptian religious objects and houses of worship down to their dimensions. Right, to the exact ratio of dimensions. I don't have any investment in us being the founders of all of this, but I also don't want to say that Judaism or Israelite religion is derivative if what we mean by that is that it's just a knockoff. I'm somebody who is just extraordinarily proud to be Jewish. And that pride goes back, not to all things, to be honest, right? Let's be honest, not to all things, but to so many of the things. And when we see how Hammurabi's code, for instance, is different than what we have in Exodus, usually, not always, but usually, like, it reflects a morality that I consider to be more progressive. And I'm happy to claim it as my own.
Well, thank you. I'm proud to be Jewish as well. And I'm proud that you're a friend of mine. And I'm proud that you're from California. And I'm really happy that you spent time with us talking about your new book and giving us a lot to think about. Ahuva's going to go home and lie down now. Oh, she's at home. She's going to lie down and now, have to go back to all her biblical studies and now start taking it apart because of you. Thank you for giving her lots to think about, and all of us. And I see the Browers are on, who obviously knew your mom, and lots of people online who knew your mom here. So I go back to saying your mom is up there, proud of you. She probably now is going to go to God and challenge God and everybody up there about everything that you've said and say, you know what, my son just told me this. So we're going to have a little meeting with the rabbis up here, and we're going to have a little discussion. So you may see a thunderbolt or some lightning come into your way, I think, pretty soon in Elkins Park.
I'll let you know.
Yes, you let me know. So thank you so much. Great book. Looking forward to reading the book. Looking forward to having it. And keep us apprised as to what people say. I think you have a lot. I think it was great. A really unique perspective. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time. Wishing you all the best.
Keep safe. If you're in the area, go drop by Rav Shai's shul, just not on the last day of a Chag, because no one will be there. Oh, they will be there, but they'll.
Right, we'll be in the office. I'll make coffee for you.
Bye, everybody. Nice to see
bye-bye.
you. See you guys in about an hour and a half. Take care.